I was going to biohack my way out of depression in 90 days to become unstoppable. It didn't go to plan. And if I wasn't successful, I didn't know what I'd do next. I sold Entrepreneur Magazine a book idea that I would document my 90-day mission to beat depression. If I failed, my business and my mental health were going to take another hit. I'd been struggling with depression for 3 years. I was already at breaking point. I tried every self-help tool in my toolkit: supplements, diets, hypnosis, exercise. Nothing worked. My first step was to find a better doctor. I'd seen over 5 in total. The last one, I walked out of their office in tears because once again, I didn't find any answers as to why I'd been hit with depression, brain fog, exhaustion, and even suicidal thoughts. I was devastated after the last doctor said to me, time was of the essence. I needed to come up with a 90-day plan, and seeing as though nothing had worked in the past 3 years, I decided to take a radically different approach and talk to neuroscientists, biohackers, nutritional psychologists, and gut microbiome experts. I read what I could, when I could. I was running on fumes, but I was determined to get to the root cause of my depression. I was inspired by Silicon Valley elites who are using biohacking to optimize their bodies and brains in a myriad of different ways. In the first 2 weeks, I mapped out everything I thought could possibly help me into an Excel spreadsheet to plot where I thought this journey was going. But to be honest, I had no idea where I was going to end up or if I'd get the answers I needed. If I failed, I'd lose my book contract and I'd be broke, and then everything would really go to shit. 6 months before I signed the book contract, I moved to Florida with my partner. In the building we lived in, we were lucky enough to meet incredible people that helped point me in the right direction. They introduced me to functional medicine, so I made this my first port of call. I sat down with a functional doctor on the outskirts of Tampa, Florida, and took a blood test. Functional doctors seek to address root causes instead of merely treating symptoms. Doctors back in Australia had identified my symptoms, but not one had identified the causes, which is why seeing a different kind of doctor made sense. After all, the day that I walked out of the doctor's office in tears was after she told me I looked fit and healthy, I should be fine. And to top it off, most people just learn to live with fatigue. Imagine hearing that comment when you're desperate for help. It not just broke me, but later it also lit a fire in me. There was no way in hell I was going to accept that as my new normal. I wasn't going to live like a zombie for the rest of my life and just say, hey, this is how it is. I was going to do whatever it took to get better, even if it meant I had to sign a book contract that would give me access to the resources and experts that I didn't have. And yes, I realized just how crazy that idea is in hindsight. Wait until you hear what happens next. A few days after my appointment, I had a call that gave me my first glimmer of hope. My blood panels came back and they had identified that I was on the very low range of vitamin D, which seemed absurd considering I was living in sunny Florida. And previous blood tests were also normal. It also indicated I was on the verge of having major thyroid issues. It wasn't the only insight I gained from my checkup, but it sparked a fierce level of curiosity as well as a lot of anger. Why hadn't other doctors picked this up? So I reached out to another doctor, Dr. Mara Francis, to get some answers. She shared that the standard guinea pig in medicine has always been the 70 kilogram or 154 pound man, which was originally set by the American College of Physicians. That's what these normal, healthy ranges are typically based on. Thankfully, research is improving because obviously not everyone fits that demographic. And this next part is an invaluable lesson I learned the hard way. When we get our test results back from the doctor, we must ask, are we at the high end or the low end of the normal range? And this goes for whatever you're being tested for, especially nutritional deficiencies and hormonal imbalances. You can be told your results are normal, but if you're at either end of the spectrum, you could be on the verge of a major health crisis if cause isn't corrected. And this led to my next major insight. Bio-individuality. We each respond to external stimuli differently: the food we eat, medications we take, pollution in the air, and chronic stress. No one responds exactly the same. Even though I was in what was considered the normal range, I was already exhibiting major symptoms, and later I'd find out why. Now that I'd identified a major nutritional deficiency, vitamin D, I wanted to explore how that was possibly affecting my mental health. I uncovered that multiple studies had found a connection between low levels of vitamin D and higher rates of major depressive disorder and suicidal ideation. Any psychological stress or trauma being experienced can be amplified by a simple vitamin D deficiency. It's like turning up the volume on an annoying song. Which led me to my next hurdle. I'd been having major digestive issues and became curious about its connection with depression via the gut-brain axis. My functional doctor suspected that I had an overgrowth of Candida in my intestinal tract based on the symptoms I presented with. And here's where it got really interesting. In biohacking my way back from depression, I chose to make a long list of everything that had occurred before my symptoms flared up: where I lived, what I was eating, any stress I was under, and any medications I was on. I'd just spent 3 months traveling around the US on my very first real vacation before my symptoms flared up. Upon returning, due to a sinus infection, I was prescribed a course of antibiotics. 3 years after I took them, I came across studies that show that 2 courses of antibiotics or more in 12 months increases the risk of significant depression by up to 45%. Let that sink in. Another penny had dropped that eventually led me to a list of 7 major triggers that anyone with depression should work through with their doctor, which I'll get into later. Since taking those antibiotics, I'd experienced major brain fog, fatigue, and irregular bowel movements. It didn't matter how healthy my diet was, my gut health never rebounded. But of course, being from the self-help field myself, I blamed it on a weak mental attitude instead of realizing I was experiencing severe and long-term side effects from a common medication everyone takes at some point in their life. To get better, my doctor put me on the Candida Diet. You see, antibiotics take a scorched earth approach to your gut, like many other medications do. This means good and bad bacteria are wiped out, presenting opportunistic yeasts such as Candida and other bad bacteria an opportunity to take over. Normally, Candida lives in places like your mouth, skin, and digestive tract without a problem. But when the environment is right, it can grow out of control. Candida has been linked to everything from brain fog, chronic fatigue, depression, sinus infections, asthma, and a weakened immune system. As per my doctor's instructions, I had to do the diet for 30 days. The diet closely reflects keto because you do enter a state of ketosis where you're burning fat instead of carbs for fuel. This diet's purpose, however, is to starve the Candida and boost gut health. To be successful, you can't slip up or you're back to square one. You need to cut out more carbs or sugars than what you would with the keto diet because Candida feeds on both. And let me be clear, this diet should only be followed under doctor's orders, and you'll see why shortly. 20 days into the diet, I remember sitting in a conference room with a friend when they stopped, looked up at me and said, "Are you okay?" My symptoms became worse. Suicidal thoughts increased. I could barely function. And not being aware of it at the time, I hadn't realized that being in a state of ketosis due to the Candida diet causes major and profound shifts in brain chemistry. And while many doctors claim keto's benefits for depression, the bottom line is any credible research is still lacking. In fact, I believe keto is dangerous for people with severe depression, also due in part to metabolic inertia. I've received messages from people from around the world since sharing my story who also became suicidal on the diet themselves. You see, to enter a state of ketosis, your body must adapt to burning fat as its fuel source. The problem was, my body and brain hadn't adapted. I wasn't burning fats yet, and I wasn't burning carbs either because I cut them out. My brain was being starved of energy. I was quite literally days away from pulling the pin on the entire project and accepting my fate. But I'd signed a contract to effectively get better. The day I finished the Candida diet and gradually returned back to a normal diet, my brain fog began to lift. My energy started to return. I could think clearly again. I wasn't 100% better yet. For that, I'd have to take other multiple, but thankfully easy steps. I thought, great, we're getting somewhere. So I packed up my bag and headed to the airport. I was on my way to Canada from Florida to interview a world-leading expert and discuss nootropics and smart drugs. I'd started experimenting with nootropics like L-theanine and L-tyrosine within the first 60 days of my mission, based on recommendations from nutritionists. There are two distinct types of nootropics: pharmaceuticals, such as modafinil, and nutritional substances derived from plants. Both kinds are used to enhance cognitive function, mood, and focus. After sitting down with the expert in Canada, I was presented with the mother of all setbacks. We didn't have the right stamp in our passports to re-enter the US, and we could have to wait up to a month to get that meeting with immigration to return. On top of that, if we attempted to go through the airport, we could have been banned from entering the US altogether. On the surface, it sounds great. Yay, a holiday in Vancouver. The truth was, we had a foster dog back at home we had only had for a month. Thankfully, he was staying with our friends, but he was in a bad state. We needed to rehabilitate him. Not to mention, money was running low and all of my other interviews had to be cancelled. We landed back in the US 4 months later and thousands of dollars out of pocket. We were reunited with Mitch, who we ended up adopting. 2 months later, we moved to Hell's Kitchen in New York, where he finally showed signs of letting his guard down. Now that the 90 days were over, it was time to write the book. I hit up one of my favorite places in the world, the New York Public Library. The question was I successful at biohacking my way out of depression? Yes. And in ways that I never could have imagined. The journey took me from Australia to Florida, New York, Vancouver, San Francisco, and even LA. In 90 days, I'd tried different nootropics, diets, wearable technology, and undergone a blood and gut health test. My book, Unstoppable, which shares my journey, sold over 70,000 copies and received praise from doctors, psychiatrists, nutritionists, and athletes, something I never thought would happen in a million years. I received hundreds of comments from people saying Unstoppable had changed and even saved their lives. And here are the biggest takeaways from what I learned in these 90 days that I want you to take away. Depression has multiple and compounding elements to it. You can't just address one element. You see, there are ultimately 7 triggers anyone who is going through depression must consider that few ever do. Gut health, side effects from medications that can cause depression, toxins that affect mood and behavior, food sensitivities which cause inflammation and brain fog, especially caffeine because it interferes with brain chemicals and can even cause depression and psychosis in some, hormonal imbalances, nutritional deficiencies, and allergies, all of which can mimic psychological symptoms. The thing about depression is we must consider both sides of the coin. One side is psychological triggers like trauma or grief, the other biological. We've been trained to put all of our emphasis on dismantling depression on the psychological side. But when you realize a positive thought can only hold for as long as your biology supports it, we suddenly take a more comprehensive approach. Imagine trying to deal with childhood trauma if you're severely nutrient deficient. Your brain barely has the energy it needs to get through the day, let alone deal with the emotions you must process. And here's the biggest lesson I took away. You can try and self-medicate with self-help all you like. You may get better, but you may not get well. The day the doctor told me I looked fit and healthy, I should be fine, and I would have to just live with the fatigue for the rest of my life, was a pivotal moment. One day, I'll see that doctor again and hand her a copy of my book, and I'll say thank you. Thank you for changing not just my life, but thousands of lives around the world.